All right, folks, thanks for taking the time to come and visit with me, at least before you go off and get your meals. I know I'm standing between you and food, and it's not a great place to be, but hopefully your time will be well spent hanging out here. So let's jump into what you guys came here to see. When you see these three words, web security issues, what are the things that come to your mind? What are the things that instinctively you begin to think about when you hear these words, web security issues? Having been in the security space for quite some time, I can sort of assess and observe what I've seen over my period. And it tends to look something like the following, right? Cross-site scripting. This is what a lot of people tend to think about. Arguably the worst named web security vulnerability ever, right? Because what is it actually doing? Well, it's basically me as an attacker sending web code to a web application that subsequently serves it to someone else and has it execute in that context, right? Doesn't really map to cross-site scripting, that name. Next very common sort of thing that tends to come to mind is cross-site request forgery. Right? So this is one of these types of attacks that more and more you're beginning to see in frameworks. People are trying to bake in protection for it, right? So if you use Express, you probably use CSRF, the NPM module, to try to add some sort of protection for sysref. But fundamentally, what is sysref about? It's about taking advantage of the fact that we tend to stay authenticated on various websites, and we have authorization to do certain things on those websites, like make purchases with the credit card that is already on file, for example, right? And so the request forgery is really trying to take advantage of the trust relationship that you already have with the website. And I would say the last sort of attack or vulnerability or issue that people tend to think about when they think about web security issues is SQL-I, right? SQL injection. SQL injection, exactly, it's properly named, right? Because it's really saying, okay, where you expected data, you're actually seeing code, and this code is specially crafted such that the query that was on the back end is actually executing something that the query developer never intended. So when you look at these three sort of distinctive vulnerabilities, what's the commonality, right? What is the thing that is present in each one of these vulnerabilities that we looked at, right, as common? I would argue that they're bugs. Not, ladybugs, but implementation bugs. They're all predicated on there being some sort of implementation flaw. So said another way, if you were able to remove all the implementation flaws from code, those vulnerabilities would not be relevant. They wouldn't happen. They wouldn't be there. But you might sort of say to yourself, okay, maybe we cherry-picked those examples, right? So what would you do to sort of widen the aperture, if you will? One thing you might do is go to Google. So you can see here, you put in a search query, you can see the three items that sort of identified as being common already being listed there, and you see a few others, right? So broken authentication and session management. And what is that really about? A concrete example of that is, say, introducing into the URL, say, a session ID that if you were to share with somebody else, that person could effectively impersonate you, right? Like, that's broken, and that's broken in code, right? So that is clearly a code issue. And insecure direct object references. This is kind of obscure. The reason I know what they are is because they're actually extracted from another source that we're going to look at as well. But insecure direct object reference, right, all these abstractions slapped together, what is it really saying? It's basically saying, it's best understood through an example. Let's say that you had a query, a SQL query, for example, and one of the parameters that you utilize is one that actually is coming from the end user, right? And that input is actually a column in some table. And if the user were to perturb that value, they could see arbitrary columns in your table, which is not ideal, right? It's a bad look. And this is sort of an example of insecure direct object reference. And based on my description, you can infer that this is purely a code issue. And then security misconfiguration, you could also argue is a code issue. I mean, to the degree that your configuration can be checked in to some sort of repository, hopefully you're not putting like private keys and things like that into the repository, but to the degree that it can exist in some sort of code repo, This is something that, speaks to code issues, right, again. Now, another sort of source of, web security issues, besides sort of doing searches on the web, is looking at OAuth top 10. So we're looking at 2013 because 2017, if you know anything about that release candidate was summarily rejected. And so we're going to focus on 2013, and it's going to be germane that we focus on 2013 versus 17 for other reasons that will become obvious later. Well, if you go down this list, injection, right? So injection, we kind of already talked about injection, right, with SQL injection. This is a code issue. Broken authentication session management, again, we already discussed, code issue. Cross-site scripting, we already know somebody failed to validate the input and properly escape it. Code issue. Insecure direct object references, already talked about this. Code issue. Security misconfiguration, again, code issue. Sensitive data exposure. So this is effectively, say, putting valuable data inside of a cookie and then transmitting that over HTTP, right? Code issue, right? Missing function level ACLs, right? So that, again, is a code issue. So imagine you have like an admin panel for your website and people are able to utilize some of the functions that exist without necessarily going through that admin panel. Again, code issue. Sysref, code issue. Using components with known vulnerabilities, clearly, code issue. And then the last one here, unvalidated redirects and forwards. So, sometimes you can specify through the URL where this user should go. And if you don't properly validate that, then the user could be sent anywhere to evil.com, right? Code issue. So when you look at this, you look at search engines, you look at personal experience, you look at OWASP top 10, you see this connection. What is that saying? What does that affect? What are we experiencing? I would argue what we're experiencing is priming. We are being primed. We're primed to believe that security is equivalent to security flaws, which are equivalent to implementation flaws, right? So priming is something that we often don't think about because it's so subtle. And it's exemplified best, I think, with a classic study that happened at NYU. So at NYU, there was an experiment where you had a control group, you had a treatment group, and their task was to construct sentences of 4 words from a collection of 5 words. Now, the treatment group had allusions to being old. Never explicitly said old, but it had allusions to it. So it had words like wrinkled, words like gray, things like Florida in those words. And then the control group had no such things in it. And then after they completed that specific task, they were asked to go to another part of campus and complete another task. But that going from one part of the campus to the other was actually also part of the experiment. And what they saw was that the people who had those allusions to being old walked statistically slower than their control group counterparts. And then when they were interviewed afterwards, they had no idea that the words that they were using had any theme whatsoever. So at that subtle level, those individuals were being primed. And so when you look at all the different places in which we hear about web security issues, and all those web security issues are basically caused by implementation flaws or implementation issues, it's no wonder that when we hear web security or security in general, we think that it's just a code issue. It's just a code problem. But that focus, that being primed to focus on this particular type of issue is causing us to forget and miss out on another very prevalent issue, specifically functionality abuse. Or if you look in the literature, you might also see it as abuse of functionality. I prefer the active voice versus the passive voice, so that's why I am saying it slightly differently. But when you go and look this up, you're likely to find a variety of different explanations, right? And I think it's important that we level set on what we mean by functionality abuse before we go any deeper. So the definition here is violating a security policy by using system features designed for an end user without exploiting a bug in code. Now, there's a lot there, and we should unpack it, and so that's the next step, right? Security policy. So security policies, and we're going to see a pattern as we start to look at concrete examples of functionality abuse, but security policy is kind of important. You would be remiss, or I would be remiss, if I didn't say that you should make sure that for any app that you're developing that it actually has security policies. And what do I mean by that, right? A statement of what is and isn't allowed, right? But this is sort of the academic explanation of it. So concretely, it might look something like responses should only be readable by the requester, right? So like the server and the user agent, make sure that only the user agent and the server can read the request. And so you might have a variety of mechanisms for doing that, one of which might be encryption, right? And one of the ways that you might want to make this better is by specifying, in addition to what is and isn't allowed, under what conditions. And in this case, you're talking about the threat agent, right? What attributes of the agent or the threat agent will exist where this policy will be upheld. This is critical because when you go off to implement, the implementers will have some assumptions in their head about what they're defending against. And so to the degree you can be more specific in your policy, the better off you'll be in terms of getting what you expect. But this is the security policy piece. And then the next part here is system features that are designed for the end users, right? So what do we mean here? Obviously, we're talking about the functionality that's purposely exposed for end users. So to compare and contrast, right, deleting your comment versus deleting any user's comment. So you might have an admin user who has the ability to delete any user's comment, but the average user probably on your website probably shouldn't have the ability to delete all comments. And what that would suggest is that there's a privilege escalation vulnerability that probably exists that allows them to do that. And that really isn't going towards where we're talking with respect to functionality abuse, right? And then separately, running the site's JavaScript versus running a user's arbitrary JavaScript. The latter is like some form of injection. The former is very much within the realm of functionality abuse, right? They're not modifying your JavaScript. They're not doing anything with respect to the code, right? And then lastly here, without exploiting a bug in code. I think this is probably best exemplified by actually looking at some identified functionality abuse examples. So these examples are pulled from the OWASP Automated Threat Handbook. And so I'll reference it again after we go through the set of examples. But if you're interested in sort of understanding more of this and what you can do to defend against it, that's going to be your source to go to. So first, we'll start off with something that most of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, scraping, right? Scraping, everybody knows it, but I found that it's very difficult to define. And this is the best that I've come up with, essentially, right? It's super subjective. It's pretty much predicated on what the property owner or website owner basically decides to be bad, right? Like, I don't like the way this person is collecting data from my website, so they're scraping, right? This is hard, and you will find that this pattern exists across functionality abuse. The security policy is kind of difficult to nail down. They tend to be in a fuzzy/gray area. And so to sort of drive this point home, look at like a little small toy example, right? So you have some server out over here, and then you have curl, right? So I'm going to use curl, but remember that curl is just a stand-in for a user agent. It could be anything, right? So it could be more sophisticated, it could be phantom.js, or it could be a human being driving some user agent, right? And I think that we tend to forget that the actual other end of the connection could be a wide variety of things. And when you think about your mechanisms, you think about your policy, you need to take that into account. And so when you look at the requests look normal. There's nothing strange about that. There's nothing bizarre about the request that's going back and forth. So when you look at this through the lens of functionality abuse attributes, right, you have to say, okay, what is the policy that's being violated? Well, disallowing undesirable collection of website content, right? You have, phantom.js script collecting a bunch of content. This is violating your desire here with respect to how content is being collected. Then you have this system feature, right? Displaying content to users. Like, obviously, people should be able to get content for your website. Like, that's part inherent in having the website. So this is really taking advantage of this feature. And then, there's no bugs. There's no bugs to exploit, right? Like, this, you can just scrape at will, right? So this is one example. Another example, account creation. Now, I didn't come up with this name. Remember, I got this from the OWASP Automated Threat Handbook. But I guess it's kind of similar to scraping because scraping isn't necessarily good or bad, right? It just depends on what the property owner believes, right? Because most people probably want Google or Bing crawler to crawl their website and basically scrape their site, but they probably don't want some rando developer who just wrote a node.js script to start pulling stuff. So it's very much contingent on the use case. So account creation, the way it's meant here is creating many accounts for nefarious purposes, basically, right? So you might ask, like, why would somebody do that? Like, why is somebody interested in that? Well, this tends to go to the bad actors that are behind this and what they know about various websites. So in accounts or in situations where you have accounts that exist in some sort of community or anything like that, there tends to be some sort of reputation system. And invariably in those reputation systems, you have some notion of time or how old the account is. And so when you go to account creation, you're basically saying, okay, I want to create a whole slew of accounts because I know that one day I'm going to need to take action and I don't want to be caught immediately, right? Because I know that they treat older accounts better than they treat newer accounts. So again, what does this look like on a wire? Just to drive home the point, right? It looks totally normal. It just looks like normal traffic going back and forth, but this is done time and time again with, at high interval. So when you look at the functionality abuse attributes, right, what is the security policy being violated, right? Each account must be associated with a distinct individual unless explicitly approved otherwise. How do you defend? I mean, like, that's a really hard security policy to uphold, right? So in practice, you're probably going to have something that's more concrete than that, but this is fundamentally what you would like to have, right? Then the system feature, creating an account. Like, obviously, if you have accounts on your website, you probably want people to be able to create that. And then, obviously, there's no bugs that need to be violated or exploited in order to realize this attack. Then, we can look at carding. So carding, some of you may have heard of, right? This is really nothing more than testing out a bunch of stolen credit cards, right? So how does that work? So you have your curl script or whatever, and you have a bunch of stolen credit cards that you've gotten from all kinds of places, the darknet, among many other places in which you can get this type of information. And then you test them against a bunch of different websites, right? Maybe you find some websites that don't do proper checks and things like this, and you test them on a handful of websites, right? But your goal, really, is to test out which ones work, which ones do work, and which ones are valuable, which ones can sell for a lot, which ones can sell for a little, right? So this is the crux of carding, right? Just using your sort of credit card purchasing infrastructure. So what is the policy that's being violated? Only authorize payments for legitimate card owners. This, again, is a really hard thing to sort of make sure is present. But then you say, okay, what is the system feature? Making purchases with credit cards. This is a totally normal thing that most websites who have any sort of e-commerce capability associated with it will have and will need, right? And then you say, okay, what bugs are required to exploit it? None, there's no bugs. There's no bugs to exploit, right? And now for the last example, which is kind of similar to carding, you have credential stuffing, right? So credential stuffing is kind of like carding, but replace the cards with username and password pairs, and guess what? Bam, you have a whole different attack, right? So the goal here, instead of sort of testing out what credit cards work, here you just want to see how valuable is this particular username and password pair. You're trying to figure out what accounts actually are available to me for having this username and password pair, right? So what does that look like, right? So you have your stolen set of username and password pairs, and then it looks like everything else, right? Or it looks like the carding scenario, right? So, but you're doing this across a bunch of different websites. You have a large number of username and password pairs, and you figure out, what type of accounts this person has. And then you go in and you assess the account, and you see how valuable those respective accounts are. And this is, something that's, been happening for years now, but I still think doesn't get quite the attention that it should. So we look at it from the functionality abuse attribute standpoint. What security policy is being violated? Again, you're going to get the security policy that is kind of tough to enforce, right? Like only allow the account owner access to his or her account. Kind of tough to enforce. But that's the security policy that's being violated. Then you look at, okay, what is the system feature? Authentication. Most websites are going to need and or want authentication, right? You don't want to be able to provide access to any and everyone. And then lastly, you have this bugs required to exploit. None. You're not exploiting any bug in the system, right? You could implement your system perfectly. You still have this issue, right? So again, if you're interested in this sort of thing, OWASP, Automated Threat Handbook, that's going to be your source for a slew of other things that I didn't mention and ways to detect and defend against this. But now that we've kind of talked about some of these functionality abuse attacks, right? what can we do about the actual source of this problem, right? Which is forgetting about these types of attacks, right? Like, me mentioning these attacks is probably pretty obvious. Like, yeah, like people could do these kinds of things. But like, why wouldn't I have thought about this in the past? And the answer, right, is priming, as I mentioned before, right? We are primed to think about different types of things. We're primed to think about cross-site scripting. We're primed to think about sysref, right? And that's not the only sort of set of attacks. So in order to do that, we need to back up a little bit. And when we back up, we need to sort of think about the processes that are in our minds, right? And so the processes that have been put forward by some of the behavioral scientists is the notion of system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is your sort of fast brain, right? It's intuitive. And so when I asked you the question about web security issues, the first thing that came to your mind, that was your system 1, right? So it's all about being fast. Now you have another part. I mean, it's not necessarily different regions of your brain, but these are just different functionings within the brain. And you have another part, system 2, which is slower. So if I ask you what is, what is 243 times 18, right? If you actually, forced yourself to do that, that thing that actually started doing that computation would be your system 2. And in order for us to not forget about functionality abuse moving forward, we have to engage the system 2. And the way to engage system 2 is to engage in threat modeling. So threat modeling is an exercise that people who are sort of wanting to understand the risk that they have and what risk they're willing to take and what risk they're not willing to take, engage in. And so this is going to be, I think, the path forward for those of us who are really serious about making sure that we consider the threats that are really germane. So we'll go through real quick, what this entails. But I'm sure that many of us have probably heard about, threat modeling in the past, and maybe you've been told that you need to be some sort of security expert to produce a world-class threat model or threat assessment, and that's true. But you don't need a world-class threat assessment. You simply need a useful threat assessment. And whatever knowledge that you have about your system, that level of expertise should prove useful in the threat assessment. So let's sort of take a look at what threat modeling entails. So the first piece is threat model itself, right? So you have a goal and you have capabilities. So what is the goal? Is the goal for this attacker to steal the data of your users? Is it to sort of disrupt the service? What is the attacker's goal, right? And then the capability standpoint is like, how many IPs does this person have? Do they have access to the operating system? Are they on a local network, right? What capabilities does this attacker have? Because that's going to actually inform what type of mechanisms make sense to defend. And then assets, right? Now I'm describing this in a linear order, but this won't go in a linear process. It's going to be very cyclical, right? You're going to go back and forth, right, as you go through this, and for good reason, right? So when you look at the assets, you're going to say, okay, what is valuable in this, web app, right? Like, what are the things that somebody might think is valuable? And the important piece there is somebody, right? So naturally you think about who are the threat sources? What would these threat sources, like what are these threat sources that might have some goal or desire to actually do something, malicious to the web app that I'm responsible for? And then that will influence, like, okay, those might be assets. Even though we might not think that they are assets, other people might think that they're assets, and maybe that influences what we believe to be assets. And then, based on all of that, you can start to consider what types of threats make sense. Right? Maybe cross-site scripting isn't particularly relevant for your website, even though it's on the OWASP top 10, right? Maybe what's more relevant is credential stuffing. Maybe that's the thing you should put resources to, because guess what? You have limited resources. You're not going to be able to defend against everything, so you need to be able to look at all of them side by side and make a decision about what you're going to defend against and what you're not going to defend against. And from there, you can actually create your security policy. And you may have multiple security policies, right, for your website. But through this process, you actually know why a security policy is what it is and why it isn't something else. It's much better to be in a position to say, hey, we got hacked and we knew about that and we just chose not to protect against it versus like we were totally blindsided, right? So this is a much better scenario to find yourself in. Now, in summary, priming causes the system 1 to focus on bug security issues, right? To see security as bugs, right? That's priming causing that. Functionality abuse is the thing that we tend to forget because we are primed to focus on the security bug issues. To reduce our chance of forgetting in the future, we need to engage our system 2. And engaging our system 2 is predicated on using threat modeling. Hopefully you've heard something that expanded your view a little bit on security, and hopefully you enjoyed your time here. Thank you.